Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I've got a great stream with a great guest that I think you're really going to enjoy. Everyone is freaking out because, surprise, surprise, New York City is probably going to elect an even more radical left wing mayor, somebody who is a Muslim socialist. If you're surprised at all, then what can I tell you? They weren't going to put the woke away. And of course, we're also going to be discussing the Supreme Court's new ruling, discussing uh, Donald Trump's executive order in an attempt to end a birthright citizenship. It's a huge win for Trump, though it's not a complete victory. We'll dive into the details of that. Joining me today to talk about this is a man whose work we can all appreciate. He, of course, came up with the iPhone, the iPad, the iPod, the iMac. Young Steve Jobs. Thank you so much for stealing credit from Steve Wozniak.
Thank you, Auron. What can I say? There's few things better in life than seeing a good idea, stealing it, and then becoming massively wealthy off the back of it. And you know what? I've decided to take my billions of Apple dollars and become a niche internet micro celebrity.
To be fair, I think that's kind of ultimately what Mark Zuckerberg would have wanted to do. You know, that's like the transition he's trying to make, right? Like,
Yeah, true,
I'm just a dude, bro. Who cares if I own
just
this
a normal guy, right?
company? Yeah, exactly.
Just a normal non-lizard human.
Well, Jay Burton is back with us today, guys. So we're going to dive into the issues. So, like I said, we have this guy, and I'm going to pronounce his name wrong multiple times, and I don't care. It's Zohran Mamdani. He was running against, of course, the former governor Andrew Cuomo in this New York City mayor's race. It's the primary going into the general election. Now, the current mayor, Eric Adams, will be running as an independent, and really his big problem is just the disaster that New York has become. Not that it wasn't trending that way before he got into office, but it's only gotten worse under his control. And he's got a 67% disapproval rating, which is a pretty good sign. He might not make it against the new candidate, but he also has a 76% of respondents in a poll agreed that he is corrupt and should not run again. So I do like that there's like a 9-point difference of people who say he's corrupt and shouldn't run again, but they don't necessarily disapprove. I really enjoy that.
It's New York, right? At a certain point, if you've lived there for long enough, you're probably just resigned to it. Like, yeah, sure, he's corrupt and awful, but he's our corrupt, awful politician.
Yeah, it really is the most New York of all poll results, and probably leads you to understand why the city isn't exactly the state that it's in. But a lot of people are kind of getting outraged at the selection of this guy because, again, as a lot of people, again, understandably, believed, coming off of kind of the woke radical part of the Democratic Party, driving everybody crazy, pushing everything to the edge of insanity, clearly making the Democratic brand toxic among a large segment of America. A lot of people believe that the elites would put the woke away. And Cuomo, to be fair, is an effort to do that, right? I mean, he's not exactly a doctrinaire centrist, but at least he represents the establishment version of the party, something that's not going to be completely insane most of the time. And it's very clear that he was rejected by the voters. And instead, they picked this guy who is a card-carrying socialist. He is both a Muslim and a socialist, though we can see that he's going to be a leftist before he's a Muslim here in a moment. A lot of people are focusing on the Islamic portion of it. Okay, this guy he's a Muslim. He wants the global intifada. He's a Palestinian promoter. You know, he's pro-Palestinian. These things. Clearly, we're worried about this Muslim invasion of New York. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't think Muslims should be allowed to hold office in the United States. I don't think they should be coming into the United States. This is a Christian country, and that's really what we should be promoting inside the United States. However, I'm not really worried that this guy is going to be a Muslim first and foremost, because a lot of his tweets are talking about how trans rights are the most important thing. I guess you could look at Iran and its solution to homosexuality and say maybe that is pro-Islam. But in general, it's very clear that this guy is a progressive first, and the Islam thing is just part of the intersectional mix.
Well, definitely. And look, I understand the rancor, right? I would not want to live in a city headed up by a Muslim. Fine. All right. Maybe this is different if you are in a Muslim country, but America is not. The Muslim population of America is incredibly new. And I think one of the relevant factors about this is, unless I'm incorrect, he has been a U.S. citizen for only 8 years, a very, very short amount of time. And so even if he's not necessarily, shall we say, a Wahhabi, right, some sort of violent Muslim extremist, there's a very real concern of why is this guy here and why is he the presumptive leader of the largest, most important city in America, right, the center of global finance. And look, I'll be honest, I have much more objections to his leftism than his relative Muslimness, just because he isn't particularly devout. But at the same time, each one of these are very real concerns. And so even if it's not necessarily, shall we say, the primary thing on the triage list, it's still a very real concern.
Yeah, a little bit of background for those who aren't familiar. So this guy is an Indian. His father is he's of Indian ethnicity. His father is Indian, but he was born in Uganda, actually. So he spent the first few years of his life in Uganda, and then his family moved to South Africa for a time. They moved to the United States when he was 7 years old, but as you say, I believe he's recently actually naturalized. He hasn't been naturalized as a U.S. citizen for that long. Hilariously enough, he used to be a like D-list rapper. Like you can go get his SoundCloud stuff. I'm really not even joking. The rap name, I promise guys, this is not a racist joke. Okay, we did not set this up beforehand. These are just the facts, okay? His rap name was Young Cardamom. Okay. And he apparently has done several collaborations with Ugandan rappers. So obviously this is a guy who really integrated into the American society. He's one of those immigrants that immediately took on all those American traits that we're told. He touched the magic soil and immediately decided that he was going to transform himself into as American person possible when he's not doing Ugandan crossover rap under the handle Young Cardamom. So kind of amazing, but here we are.
Yeah, it's you can imagine just the absolute look of shock and horror on the American founder's face. Sorry, a funny super chat. But to explain that not only would the leading city in America be headed up by what they would have considered a Mohammedan, right, a pagan, but that he would be an incredibly embarrassing one too. Again, like
you can't even get like Saladin, right? Like you have to get
right, exactly. Like at least then it's like, say what you will about the guy, but he was a tough, serious person. And then this guy, it's like, oh, just the worst millennial stereotypes, like just bundled together with an embarrassing music career. To quote a great man, they're not sending their best.
It's absolutely amazing. Now, just to run down some of his insane policies, because they're, of course, exactly what you would expect from a guy who's this radical. He's basically for prison abolition. He's talked about the need for the state to own the grocery stores in New York because food prices are out of control. And if there's one thing that has proven time and time and again to solve out of control food prices, it's government run and controlled grocery stores. Just never failed ever. He's also, and amazingly, come out again repeatedly as a trans rights advocate, talking about how the police are violent to trans people and all these things. Again, very devout Muslim. Really have to worry about that Islamification. I've made this joke many times over, but America's greatest defense against Islam is actually just homosexuality. Like we can queer their kids faster than they can turn us to jihad. Apparently this is exactly the same thing here.
Dark but true. Dark but true.
It's it's unfortunate, but that is our best defense, but it is a defense nonetheless.
If you were, hypothetically speaking, a particularly motivated trans activist who is very interested in passing, a burqa is probably your best bet. So maybe there's some sort of synergy there we hadn't considered.
Easy to tuck in the burqa there. Yeah, that's didn't think about that garment as a particularly useful tool for trans men, but you are correct. Yeah, you could probably fool a decent amount of guys with a little bit of makeup and just an eye slit. In addition to this, he's also talked about that policing theft is violence, not theft itself. Of course, property crime isn't really violence, is a big socialist talking point. And the one that is started to draw a lot of attention, and Armand Dillon over in the Civil Rights Division with the Trump administration has already said she's got her attention, on this should he attempt to implement the policy. But one of the things that Mamdani said outright is that he plans to tax white people at a higher rate, that he wants to shift the tax burden in New York to target white people specifically so that they can bear a larger amount of the burden. Now, two things about that. One, it's really nice when they say it out loud so that people can't call us conspiracy theorists. When you talk about anti-whiteness, when you talk about the attack on white people in the United States, the direct systemic interest in punishing white people in the United States, policies like this make it very clear you're not crazy, you're not some kind of fringe racist, you're just pointing out the literal text of laws that are being either passed or suggested by guys like this who entered the country expecting to come in, radically change the country, and turn over all of your money to his constituents. The other thing is to recognize that this policy is only the explicit expression of what has more or less been the policy in the United States for both of our entire lives. This is very clearly the aim of a lot of Democratic policies, is to ensure that the tax burden is almost entirely placed onto white Americans, as they also tend to make up the brackets that have the income that pays the majority of taxes in the United States. And so this seems radical, but it is only in that it states the thing that shouldn't be made obvious, right? It's just saying the quiet part out loud. So nice of him to come out and say this, even though obviously the policy itself is horrendous.
Well, definitely. Again, young Cardamom doesn't seem to be, shall we say, a Rhodes Scholar, right? He's not exactly our best and brightest. And so it's actually a useful thing because, again, all of these policies are implicitly promoted by the Democratic Party, by any number of these kind of civil rights acts. But they were smart enough to church them up a little bit, right? Make it so the language was strictly egalitarian. Now, what actually happened was, as you've said, very different. But there is some utility in having someone who just says it, who says the quiet part out loud. And you oftentimes see this around the fringes of the Democratic Party, right? The kind of blasted mental hellscape that is people like the Squad or something like that, who say these radical things that win them accolades among left-wing circles online, are, to be honest, simply following their ideas to the logical conclusion. They're just not smart enough to realize that you shouldn't say that yet. That's what you say once you've won, not while it's still contested, if that makes sense.
Well, and I actually, funny enough, I'll be releasing this on Monday while I'm traveling, but I just recorded an interview with Scott Yenner over at Boise State. Is one of the political science professors there, but he just wrote a piece about how the gay rights movement is undergoing a similar problem. They went with the radical, let's tell everybody everything we really believe approach in the 70s. And then they recognized by the 90s that this was actually hurting their movement and it was actually pushing down approval for gay marriage and gay rights and all these other things. And so they kind of went into the will and grace mode. They cleaned everything up, right? They made sure that you only saw a very small select portion of gay life that made it look like, okay, this is going to be pretty normal. These guys are just going to have families and kids and whatever, have professional jobs. They're just like you. And then when they won, once you got Obergefell, all of a sudden, like all the kink, all the, pederasty, everything just exploded. And people are like, whoa, what happened? Right. I was promised, the kind gay man down the street with 2 adopted sons for some reason. And now I'm getting mystery. And now I'm getting instead like guy with a ball gag dancing around in front of my kid, demanding that be a public spectacle at least a few times a year. And that kind of blew their minds. And we're seeing something very similar with the left here. They thought they got to the end of history, right? They thought that they had kind of got to the point where there's just no way they were going to have to face real elections again or any real opposition again. I mean, heck, they just started throwing their opposition in jail. So obviously they didn't think that was going to be an issue. And then they kind of just told their activist class, well, you can just blow it all out, guys, because we don't need to control you anymore. We can embrace all this stuff. We had to play it very carefully beforehand to get you into these positions of power. But now that this is just not going to be an issue anymore, we can embrace everything. And the activist class took that to heart, right? They really thought that was something that they were going to get to do. They started admitting everything that they were hiding beforehand, or stuff that was only spoken of in kind of esoteric language inside of academia, these things started to bubble up and actually manifest themselves in like real races and real politics. And once they realized they had made a mistake, and actually there was still enough fight left in the American people to push back, and Trump is coming back and these kind of things, they're trying to shove all this back in the closet, but it's too late. Like, people have already seen the ball gag. They've already seen the guy in the dog costume. They've already seen the Muslim mayor screaming, that America is deeply evil and that the police need to be abolished and that we need anti-white taxes. Like, there's just no putting it away, no matter how wise it would be. They just can't stop this march.
Well, you see a very similar thing with immigration, right? We are in the midst of, shall we say, a spirited national conversation about immigration. And the Mont and Bailey of that, the position they retreat to is, well, these people provide an essential role in the economy that Americans are unwilling or unable to fill. I'm sure you've seen the articles about rich LA women being forced to hide their nannies and housekeepers. That is the position. And yet what we see is, again, and I keep banging on this drum, the largest city in America is going to be ruled by a foreigner, by a man who is not from here, very clearly does not care particularly at all about the people who live in the country that has generously decided to host him. He actively hates them. And again, that is what this sort of level of replacement migration means. Your cities will be ruled by other peoples. Right? It's described as a curse biblically. Right? You will be ruled by other peoples. And
literally
instead,
the judgment of God. Yeah,
exactly. Right. On the level of plagues of locusts. Right. And instead, we're being told that if you want to oppose this, not only are you horribly racist, but also look at this crying picture of my kid's nanny. Why are you trying to send her back? And again, right, it's that classic situation where if you were smart, if you were a perfect Machiavellian, moving the pieces around the chessboard, this is something you would want to hide because it naturally rubs people the wrong way. They don't want to be ruled by foreigners. I mean, go back to Caesar, right? Why did the Gauls rebel? Well, because they're being ruled by Romans. They feel that is some sort of injustice. And that instinct is buried very deeply in the nature of man. And so to your point about the woke not being put away, it undoubtedly is the correct choice tactically, but are they able to do it? It seems as if the answer is no. And one of the other things that I think is important to talk about this is the demographics of the electorate, specifically who was present at his the celebration after he won the primary. If you look around the room, it is entirely white millennials, right? There's really no one under the age of about 28 and really no one north of about 45, right? That's pretty much the stack you've got. And again, if we look at the Democratic Party, the baby boomers have largely not selected replacements. There's still that age coterie at the top. You can think of people like Pelosi, pick your favorite octogenarian Democrat. They're there. There's very few people from that age cohort to the millennials. And the millennials who are going to replace these aging, shall we say, graded on a curve, more reasonable Democrats are rabid progressives. So sure, if you were smart, you would not be playing into those sort of inclinations. You would not be playing to those tendencies, but simply by the nature of needing to backfill the team as people either pass or are, retiring, who are they going to slot into those roles? Giuliani to young Cardamom, I cannot say his name, so we'll go with his sobriquet there. That's a perfect example, right? Like Giuliani is relatively old man. As you've said, he's not exactly woke. He's a Democrat. He's not a particularly good person. He's probably just as corrupt.
Cuomo there.
Oh, excuse me. My mistake.
A different octogenarian.
Yeah, cycling through aging New York politicians. My mistake. Yeah. But point is, right, not a good person, not someone I particularly like, but he didn't say things like this, even if he meant them. And so I think that this sort of transition where we see an aging, more quote unquote bipartisan, quote unquote respectable Democrat being replaced with a young radical, that trend is only going to continue. They don't make more baby boomers anymore.
It's really insane that this has moved this direction, but you're right that the aging out of the older Democrats also means the aging out of the establishment of the party. And to be clear, that's happening to both, right? In a lot of ways, guys like us on the right are kind of waiting for that cycle to happen because we know that, obviously I'm older than you, but us and everyone behind us is much more right wing than the actual Republicans, the actual conservatives who are in media and politics right now. And there's just a certain generational issue that once kind of the boomers age out and most of Gen X really just didn't involve itself very heavily in politics, this is going to fall to a bunch of people who have moved very far to the right. And to be fair, the left is having the same thing, right? They ultimately do not like their institutions. They don't like the people who have been a central part of the mainstream of their movement. And as soon as that cohort is gone, like you say, I think a lot of these people wanted to support the most radical leftist thing they could, but they knew that they couldn't do that. They knew that was critical to them staying viable in the political arena, these kind of things. But the young and hungry ones, they don't care, right? And they know that the people who are going to be voting for them, that next generation, once the boomers are gone, they're all in on the left wing policies. They look at Eric Adams and they don't say, "Oh, these failed Democratic policies, they're so bad, let's pick a Republican." Like everyone's looking at the Republican in the race and they're not even bothering because he's already lost Eric Adams before. They don't think he has a chance in hell. Giuliani was a very long time ago, right? The idea that a Republican mayor is going to come in and ride in is going to save him is really just not effective. And I think it's important for people to look at this and realize that ultimately, if you don't have an understanding that this is just not going to change, that the the democracy, the idea that democracy works, that popular sovereignty works, is the idea that voters are going to look at the result of who they elected and they're going to say to themselves, "This did not work, and we need a new set of policies, and we are going to change direction." And obviously, with the election of Trump, some level of that is possible. But when we look at these Democratic strongholds, that is never coming. Like the days where New York might, swing the pendulum between a competent Republican, like a moderate competent Republican to like fix everything and then back to a leftist Democrat because they can't control themselves. That at least had some equilibrium. There's some kind of stasis involved in that shift. Those days are gone. There is no Rudy Giuliani who's going to get elected and just come in and clean all these things up. And a lot of this comes with demographics. Now, a lot of people have correctly pointed out, and you just did, that young Cardamom's biggest supporters are leftist white liberals, right? Like that's some of his hardest core supporters. But you have to understand that in addition to the support of the minorities that come in, the more you have this concentration of minorities, the more the only white Americans who are going to live in that area tend to be very liberal people. And so increasing the diversity doesn't just increase the number of minorities who are going to vote for more radical and leftist ideas. It also ensures that the few white Americans left in that area are only going to be the kind of people who are going to push for more diversity, more leftism, this kind of thing. And so the sea change in demographics, even if it doesn't immediately show up in particular supporter numbers, is always going to move you this direction. It's very hard for a lot of people, even on the right, to grasp. But if you elect left, or if you import a third world style population, you're going to get third world politics. That's just all there is to it.
And to your point about voters not learning, this is something we've seen over and over and over again. California is a great example. Really, I mean, since the, let's just say, late 80s, early 90s, that has been a blue state, massively so. And while there was a brief exception, right, we had Arnold in, one not much of a Republican, right, not exactly a fire-breathing conservative, but also that state has declined massively since then. And what is the rhetoric? Over and over and over again, the rhetoric is not, we have gone too far. It is, we haven't gone far enough. And the thing halting us, the thing preventing us from achieving this liberal utopia, well, it's the racist, horrible white guys in the past. And as those get ever more faint, right, as it becomes further and further, from living memory, well, that doesn't stop them, right? They will still continue to blame that. One of the reasons that systematic racism is such a magical word is it is this sort of impossible to measure thing, right? It is this formless evil that accounts for all of the things that go wrong in our plans. You may remember that the Soviets had this term wreckers, right? Which is the guys that allegedly are still, Russian monarchists who are running around messing up the production tables and smashing the factories. And that's why you don't have enough razors or you don't have any butter, right? It's the wreckers. It's not us. We didn't do anything wrong. And similarly, there's a problem with a lag. A lot of these horrible policies take several years to be implemented and then to metastasize. I don't know how long young Cardamom is going to be in office, but let's pick a nice round number, 4 years. He's in there for 4 years. It takes him a few to get things done. And then he moves on to something else. Maybe his music career picks back up and he's, opening up clubs all across Africa. Well, his policies, the damage that he's done, may not become apparent until he's well out of office, at which point, well, he's out of the picture. We can blame the problems with this on good old reliable systematic racism or something else, right? We can find something to hang this on. And the reason I bring this up is because we've seen this over and over and over again. These cities don't magically turn it around, right? Entropy works on, it's not linear, right? It's exponential. Things get worse and worse and worse. And occasionally we see places like San Francisco sort of touch the brakes, right? Or as they did in Portland, right? Say, okay, whoa, we're going to pull back. You can't smoke crack on the sidewalk. You can in your tent, but not on the sidewalk. And you could look at that and say, oh, they're learning. It's like, well, are they? That still is a dramatic degree of degradation from that city 10, 20, 30 years ago. And to your point, right, the incentive set up by democracy in these cities is only to make things worse. Again, we've seen this playbook run dozens of times. And at a certain point, right, if you're talking to Charlie Brown the 30th time he's missed the football, you can be forgiven for getting a little bit frustrated trying to explain the problem to him.
So I think a lot of people, there's a couple responses to this. The first one is, well, it's New York. They're just going to destroy themselves. This is the consequence of their actions. And to be fair, I have some sympathy for this. Like ultimately, as a guy who is very, very tired of having my life ruined by blue staters. I live in Florida. We were constantly invaded by these people until Ron DeSantis basically forced the state somewhat red again with his policies and kind of the selective pressure that those put on who is coming here. But obviously, they don't just come to Florida. They wreck all kinds of different states. New York is unfortunately also a seat of power. And so, a lot of people have had the debate between do we abandon these cities? Do we try to retake them? What's the way to do this? Now, I have heard some people talking about consent decrees and just basically reconstructing New York. If you can pull this off, guys, I'm all in. Like, to be clear, I am all for removing the sovereignty of New Yorkers. They obviously are not capable of self-government, and it should be taken from them if at all possible. But I think that's about as realistic as secession at this point. And so I guess the question is, do we think there is any hope? I mean, I don't think we're going to see an organic turnaround. Like all of a sudden these people are going to just, as you say, like see the light and, they're going to recognize the consequences of what they've done. And they're going to start electing, sterling right-wing guys to come in and clear this. Like, I don't think that moment's ever happening. The best you can hope is that they stop running, a mile at a time and maybe they slow down a little bit, but I seriously doubt that's going to even happen. Is there any hope that there's another way to stop this process of cities like this continuing to radicalize, or is this just an inevitable fate for where our country's going?
I mean, I'll put it this way: I don't think anything is inevitable. There are a number of historical examples of entropy being reversed, right? Of problems actually being solved. The problem is relying on democracy to achieve those goals is sort of a losing prospect. Again, you mentioned immigration. That is the hole in the democracy game. You can simply increase the number of players in the game until you have an absolute majority. Similarly, right, we mentioned the tax burden. Well, you can also, once you have the power of the purse strings, basically say, well, I can't pay you to vote for me, but I can create these other programs which will effectively do that. Right? That is a huge open hole. And so at the risk of saying something too radical, I don't know if there are democratic solutions to these democratic problems. There may have to be, shall we say, a top-down decision made. Those are possible, but within the constraints of the system as it currently exists, I don't think there's a way to solve that. To your point about cities writ large, I certainly understand the desire to remove yourself from cities. On a personal level, that is the correct move to make. You don't want to end up like Daniel Penny. Obviously, right. He skated, but to say it ruined his life is probably an understatement. Right? He will never be a normal person again. And that was a near run thing. So on an individual level, if I was giving advice to you, Auron MacIntyre, who for whatever godforsaken reason lived in Brooklyn, I would tell you to leave. But the problem is, as you've said, cities are the seat of power. That is where culture is germinated. That is where power is concentrated. Obviously, New York is the financial center of the world. And so in order to have a rejuvenated America, those cities will have to be, in a strictly nonviolent, completely legal, political way, retaken. They will have to be brought into line, because otherwise, and I say this as someone who much prefers small town America to the big city, well, those cities will have to be brought in line. There is no other way to do it. It is simply the way humans organize themselves, that the sort of votive force of a nation is concentrated in its cities.
I think that's very true. And it's not an easy problem to solve. I think I pretty much agree with everything you laid out there. And so I think we're going to be on this track for a while until something changes very radically. And like I said, I just would not, obviously he's still, the young cardamom has to win against Eric Adams in November. But the current poll numbers make that seem pretty much like a foregone conclusion. Anything could happen between now and then. But I would say that the very serious likelihood is that New York is only going to get worse going forward here. All right. So our other topic today is the Supreme Court made a big ruling. They named a number of big rulings. Maybe we'll break down the other ones later. But this is the most important one, I think, for some of guys like us, is that they ruled 6-3 in a strange, Amy Coney Barrett win. That ultimately the lower courts cannot throw out these never-ending kind of nationwide hindrances to what Donald Trump is doing. They can't just throw an injunction on every single executive order that Trump passes. The lower courts don't have that ability. In fact, Amy Coney Barrett really slapped around Ketanji Jackson in her majority opinion, saying that they're basically the minority, which is the exact three justices you'd expect, are basically just ignoring all precedent and all law, and they're just saying whatever they want. Like their ruling has absolutely no connection to history or reality.
It was basically how to tell someone to shut up in a much longer legal document. It was the most dismissive thing I've ever seen written from the Supreme Court, which, I mean, given many of the justices' responses to Judge Jackson, that's an impressive bar to clear, but it seems that they were particularly fatigued with this woman in this specific instance.
High degree of Jackson fatigue. Very, very much you can be felt all across the Supreme Court. So the other reason that this ruling is so important is it is the way that they ruled on this was while evaluating the claims that Trump's executive order more or less attempting to end birthright citizenship under the 14th Amendment, that the lower courts couldn't use injunctions to stop that executive order. Now, to be clear, they avoided the issue as to whether or not the executive order itself is constitutional, whether it properly addresses the requirements of the 14th Amendment. For those who are unfamiliar, the 14th Amendment says that anyone born on American soil is an American citizen, but the key part of that was in the context. The 14th Amendment was written after slaves were freed, and so the idea was we need to make it clear. The question was, okay, this person is no longer a slave after the 13th Amendment, but are they a U.S. citizen? Because those aren't necessarily the same thing. They weren't a citizen when they were born. Do they need to naturalize? Can they naturalize? What is the process here? And so the 14th Amendment lays out what you need for being a citizen. Now, the key phrase the one that is ignored by advocates of birthright citizenship, is that the 14th Amendment says that that person must be under basically the legal dominion of the United States and not another nation. Now, people who are citizens of another nation when they have a child here are under still the legal auspices of that nation. They are not officially Americans. They are not completely under American jurisdiction. And so their children are also not completely under American jurisdiction. And so that is the argument for not extending a birthright citizenship. You must basically already be a citizen of the United States when your child is born so that you are under the legal jurisdiction and therefore they are a citizen via the 14th Amendment. That would not apply to people who are here illegally with both parents. I think more or less it would still apply to someone with one parent, but it would not apply if both parents were not legal citizens at that time. And so what you have is a situation where there's been a long and I think intentional misreading of the 14th Amendment in order to throw open the doors of the United States and create the anchor baby phenomenon many people are familiar with. You know, we have obviously many people from South America and Central America who come here in an attempt to gain citizenship for themselves and their children. There are entire Chinese tourism industries basically built around taking pregnant women and bringing them to the United States so that their children will be dual citizens, because there's another thing that America needs to get rid of, dual citizenship. But basically, there's an entire industry around basically farming this loophole, this intentional loophole in the 14th Amendment. And so the Trump executive order doesn't get rid of the 14th Amendment. It doesn't even change the legal reading of the 14th Amendment, but it simply says we are looking at the text of the 14th Amendment, and as we understand it, that means that we do not need to issue documents. We do not need to issue federal documents of citizenship to these immigrant children, like that we are not required to recognize them as citizens and hand them documents. Now, obviously, this is probably going to be ignored by different jurisdictions. The sanctuary jurisdictions are probably going to ignore this as well. There's still going to be judges who are going to try to challenge this one way or another, but this puts the Trump administration on pretty firm footing when it comes to denying these nationwide injunctions, saying, look, we've got this Supreme Court ruling. We don't really care what you say as a district judge because Supreme Court has already told us that you are violating the law.
Yeah, and I think it's important to mention in the broader context of the Trump administration, or Trump 2.0, there were a number of grand promises made. And I think myself and many others looked at those with a certain degree of skepticism. If nothing else, if we are able to plug this hole, this is a win. This is a huge win, right? When we talk about the way in which America has been sort of replaced and rebuilt with a new nation, this is the way it was done, right? The way that the country transformed after 1964 and the Hart-Celler Act had a large part to do with birthright citizenship, which is very clearly a really stupid idea, right? If you actually cared about having a real country with real laws. And while it is stupid, it's also a very good way to stay in power, right? We mentioned the mechanism earlier, where if you can simply increase the number of players who like you, well, you can win almost any popularity contest. And so to me, right, the fact that the Supreme Court has vindicated the Trump administration on this it's a huge development. It's genuinely great news. And obviously, as you've said, there will be fights, there will be, new legal loopholes. But if this is an indication of things to come, this is a very, very strong sign that we are returning to some semblance of normalcy with regards to immigration.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the Supreme Court could still come back and say that ultimately the executive order does violate the 14th Amendment, or give an official reading that moves against it. But let's be honest, if that was going to be the move, then leaving the injunctions in place would probably have made more sense. Maybe the court is just jealously guarding its territory. We're the Supreme Court. We're the one that makes these final rulings. Stop trying to cut us out of the process by creating these nationwide injunctions. That's possible, but I think it's probably connected to the larger fact that if push comes to shove, they might rule in Trump's favor. Again, there's still a big battle to be had there. I think that a correct reading of the 14th Amendment is pretty critical to the future of the United States, if not the overturning of the 14th Amendment, but that's a much longer discussion. But it's very critical that the birthright citizenship ends. And if Trump does nothing but shut the border and end birthright citizenship, it will have been the greatest win that any Republican politician has ever handed me in my lifetime, except maybe the Roe v. Wade overturning, right? Like these are, in my mind, I think this is more significant, even though both are important. And so it's one of those scenarios where I want the big deportations. Trump has actually come out and said he's promising at least 1 million a year. It's a good start, but not enough. Obviously, Biden led in at least 8 million. So you need to do 2 million a year during your 4-year term just to catch up with the damage he's done. But I think people should recognize that whether Trump ultimately is successful in mass deportations or not, he has already made some of the most radical reforms to our immigration system that have ever happened in United States history, very much so in my lifetime. And so I think you should continue to push for more, but recognize you are getting way more than you ever expected out of Donald Trump.
Well, and last time I was on your show, Auron, I was sort of in an unusually emotional outburst for me, railing against what we thought then was a full-on war in Iran. Now, obviously, that's been walked back. I definitely applaud that. And look, there are a multitude of problems facing America. But fundamentally, if we lose immigration, we lose everything. And so as much as I would like to be in a world where you and I got everything we wanted, that's not the situation we're in. But if there is one play that rooks us, right, that basically puts us permanently into a losing position, it's immigration. And so everything else is great. Like, yes, those are all very, very real threats, things that need to be addressed. But fundamentally, and I think the president recognizes this, immigration is at the core. Not because I personally think it is more important to end immigration than to pick any other pet issue, right? To ban transgender surgery for minors or anything. But because if we don't get that one, right, if we don't get the keystone, the whole arch falls. And so I think that the unwavering focus from the Trump administration on this issue is well placed. Because again, right, like you can look at the same tables I can. It's sort of a near run thing. And again, I'll mention it for the umpteenth time, as America ages, those problems worsen. And so effectively, if there is a time to do it, we're pretty close to the 12th hour, if you see what I'm saying.
Yeah, and guys, we need to lay this on the table. I think a lot of people who are watching this are probably already familiar, but for the wider audience out there, we need to just say this truth explicitly, okay? The Democratic Party knows that minority in immigration is the key to victory. They believe, the Democratic Party believes that demographics is destiny. This is not a question. This is their explicit strategy, right? They laugh about it. They will boast about it. As long as you don't notice it, then it's celebration parallax, right? Then, oh, great replacement, it's a conspiracy theory. But they will joke about it. They will celebrate it on live television when they think that nobody is going to hit them on it. You're just not allowed to notice. And nothing shows this more clearly than the situation in New York. The more that New York is transformed by immigration, the farther left it goes, the more radical its politicians become. Just like Ronald Reagan, who's electable in the 80s, before the 80s, becomes completely unelectable after his own amnesty. Rudy Giuliani, who's electable, when I was a kid, when the late 90s, early 2000s, becomes completely unthinkable as the demographics of the city change. And the right is just in this delusional mindset that like conservatives are just in this delusional mindset still that like it's all just a marketplace of ideas. And if you just look, we'll just show them the pie charts. We'll just show them the numbers. We'll just bring the better arguments. They'll see the consequences of their voting and it'll change. But New York really, really needs to disabuse you of that understanding of politics. If you think that's how democracy works, at this point, I'm sorry, you're blind or you're stupid, because it is very obvious from the evidence we are looking at literally right now in real time that the more a country transforms its demographics, the more it transforms its politics. We see this in New York. We're going to see it everywhere else. And so if the Democrats are telling you their explicit strategy is to get as many non-white people into the country as possible in hopes of changing the demographics and therefore changing the voting patterns, then Republicans have to understand that political reality. Even when it comes to legal immigration, the more people you bring in from the third world and other countries that are not like your own, the more your country will become like theirs. You will not win arguments with them. You will not explain to them why your system of government is just the best. And that's why they need to believe in the American idea. They do not care. They do not understand your civilization. They will burn your fine oak door for firewood and warmth. That is the reality of the situation. And as long as the right is obsessed with denying this because they're so scared of being racist, they're just going to lose. They're going to lose. The left knows the truth. The left celebrates this truth, and the right has to accept it. If your opponent's main and winning strategy is to import as many foreigners as possible to change the demographics and therefore change the voting in your country, and you ignore that, you're just going to lose. If you don't pay attention to the reality of demographics and voting, you're going to lose. And the left is counting on the fact that if they call you racist, you won't notice. That's it. That's the whole play. It has to change.
Well, and to your point, right? Look at the moves by, and this is verifiable. This isn't tinfoil hat stuff, of billionaires like George Soros to turn Texas blue. How is he doing that? Facilitating immigration. That is the play. And if you can see it in that constrained area, right, 1 out of 50 states, surely that works in a similar direction on the scale of a whole nation. One other thing that's worth bringing up is it's obviously difficult to change anyone's mind, particularly so when they are paid lots of money not to have their mind changed.
Right.
So to go back to our young aspiring rapper here, okay, let's say he gets what he wants. He shifts tax burden from, shall we say, legacy Americans to new arrivals, or vice versa, right? So you are, as a new immigrant, not only not being deported, right? They're saying you can stay here, but also you will stay here and pay less taxes, effectively a cash payment by another means, than anyone else. Why would you vote for another party? You're not only getting to stay here in admittedly a, shall we say, degraded city of New York, but still better than many places in the nation, in the world, but you're also getting paid, right? This patronage network enables, or basically cuts off the marketplace of ideas, right? Sure, if you were in a perfectly sealed environment, everyone was a pure rational actor with no financial ties, maybe you're right. I would dispute it even then. But that's so clearly not the situation we're in. And if you don't update your mental map, your sort of high school civics education of how the system works to what is actually happening on the ground, what good does it do? Because again, look, I would love to live in the world as described by a high school civics textbook, but fundamentally we don't. And so, sure, we can complain about that. Fair enough, even, but that's not the game we are playing. That's not the hand we have been dealt. And so ultimately, right, if you're serious about solving these issues, you cannot exist in this world of wishes. You have to look at the world as it is currently. You mentioned, Machiavelli. You've mentioned him multiple times on this show, right? Fundamentally, Machiavelli is a realist, right? He says we look at men how they are, not how we would wish them to be. Horrible paraphrase, not at all a quote. But the idea is that is how politics works. And fundamentally, one of the deep problems with conservatives is not only, you were completely correct, have they allowed themselves to be controlled by slurs like saying they're racist or homophobic or cold-hearted or any one of these other, baseless attacks, but also because they have allowed themselves to be deluded into thinking that everyone is playing the game as honorably as they would. You're not. Fundamentally, you were playing cards with a guy who's got an extra ace up his sleeve. And that ace is opening the border for 4 years and letting 8 million, either depending on how conspiratorial you want to be, either new voters or the parents of new voters into the country. So that radically adjusts your calculus when you're no longer playing a perfectly sealed, correctly dealt game of cards. Anyway, Auron, I'll throw it back to you.
No, I think that's exactly right. And obviously this is honestly the main thrust of this entire show, right? Not just this episode, but literally the entire channel, my entire program is basically just to explain to conservatives that real politics is happening and you can't have the Mr. Smith goes to Washington, aw shucks understanding and expect to win the game. If you're standing around waiting for the moment where your moral rectitude and fealty to the particular system is going to turn things around, That's a long wait for a train that's just never going to come. And so in reality, you need to recognize that this isn't about abandoning principles. This is about embracing your own principles. What are your real principles? Are your principles watching the country burn down while people completely trample over the Constitution and nothing stops them? Is that really what you're dedicated to? Or is your principle the American people? Is it America first? And therefore, you're going to do everything you can to defend those people. And that doesn't mean abandoning, your values. It means recognizing that your values are dependent on your ability to protect your people. That nobody will be living out your values when you import the world, as New York has proven to us. There will be no American conservative values once, 50, 60%, 70% of the country is some foreign born nationality. Like, that's just not how it works. And so part of protecting your values and your principles is allowing them the ability to exist. And that's going to mean taking real action here.
Well, and this is a point that Carl Benjamin has been hammering on for quite a while, right? As a conservative, are you conserving the people or the institutions? Because those institutions, as scholars of de Maistre, are outpouring sort of the flowering of the base, which is the people, right? Cultures produce certain institutions naturally. And so if you change that substrate, if you change the roots to the plant, obviously you will produce different fruit. And the idea that you can simply focus on adhering to constitutional law above all else, or focus on sort of the trappings of the American Republic, while everything else has changed and it will be the same thing, it's very clearly foolishness. That is not how any other country works. And again, this is something that is very easy to recognize in other cultures instead of our own, right? I mean, you look at English history as a great example. When England when it was invaded by the Normans, it became a different thing. Obviously, there was a mixture. It wasn't necessarily the same type of replacement migration we are seeing, but it became something else, right? It was no longer the same thing. And okay, in that case, we could maybe argue it was for the best. I'm not looking to get into a deep controversy about 1,000-year-old British history, but either way, when peoples change, their cultures change. It's almost so simple. It's a tautology. Of course they do. But this is something that we as conservatives have struggled with for a long time. And I think that if you look at what our project is, Auron, it is disabusing what I consider to be the best people in America of that false idea.
Again, there's so many historical examples. It's ridiculous. You look at the Roman Empire, the more Gauls that come in, the less Roman it becomes until it collapses. You look at the Eastern Roman Empire as the seat moves and becomes more Greek. It really is now identified as even though they thought of themselves as Roman, it's now considered the Byzantine Empire because it's so radically different. It seemed like an entirely different civilization. This is just obvious. Any student of history can do this all day, every day. And yet we're in denial here about it. And that just has to change. And I think what's happening in New York just gives us yet another window into that truth. And it doesn't do us any good to continue to deny it. All right, guys, we're going to move on to the questions of the people. But before we do, Mr. Burden, where should people be looking for your excellent work?
Sure. So you can find me on The Jay Burden Show on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you want to listen to podcasts. Auron, I appreciate you for having me on. It's always a fun time.
Absolutely. Let's see here. You have to, but I do need you to keep with the theme. I need you to dress as a different celebrity of some kind next.
Well, let me tell you, I might get a little bit of flack, but my O.J. Simpson is going to kill.
Nice.
The worst part is that started as a blackface joke and then became an O.J. Simpson became an O.J. Someone joke.
Yeah. I was hoping you intended the layers.
Yeah. We'll say I did. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Jay Burden, he's planning these things out. He's prepared. Philosophical Thirstworm 6645 says Ugandan Indians were part of the weaponized Indian clerks the Brits dumped everywhere. Beware the Guyana Indian refugees because they're close to being expelled to 0.6 countries counting now, or two. Okay, period. 6 countries counting now. I can't say I'm very familiar with the Indian diaspora across Africa. I guess it makes sense that that's a thing, but I really was completely oblivious up till this point about it.
This might be something you can have our mutual friend Ernst Van Zyl talk about, because there was a Indian population in South Africa who's still there.
One of which was young Cardamom. Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
My favorite rapper. But that is very much the case across the English Empire, what remains of it. And they are still a sort of insular ethnic group. And a lot of the riots we've seen in South Africa over the last kind of 5 to 10 years have actually been, the Boers haven't necessarily been involved. It's been, the native groups and the Indians sort of fighting back and forth. So just an interesting note that.
Did not know. Thuggo says, is he a manager class who will use leftist morality as a bludgeon for neoliberal policies like unlimited immigration and institutional thought police? Well, I would say he's actually a step beyond that. Like, obviously, a lot of people, again, were freaking about his Islamic bona fides, but I don't think he's very serious about that. Again, he'll use some of the language, but he's very clearly a radical progressive before he's any kind of religious Muslim. And I think that actually puts him beyond the managerial class. So, like, one of the problems the managerial class had is that the wokeness was a very useful doctrine for kind of giving them the excuse to tear up the firmament that they were trying to destroy inside, or so the foundation firmament's on top of you. But they're there to, tear that up and create their own thing. But they haven't been able to control the radical leftists. And so I think he's actually beyond the managerial class. I think he's part of this, a group of people who doesn't have the competence to operate inside the managerial class and is too radical to have the policies that would allow leftists to function. So I think he's going to move well beyond the neoliberal policies. Now, of course, he'll still go with unlimited immigration because that's part of their understanding. But I think he's really looking to tear down many of those neoliberal artifices. So he's ultimately an enemy of the managerial class, but only because he's a far more dangerous version of leftism. He also says, an important point is that Cuomo spent every waking moment saying Trump, Israel, Jews, while Mr. Star Wars actually talked about New York City. Yes, I meant to say this actually. So one of the critical things, and obviously his solutions to these problems are an absolute disaster. One of the important things is that this world-renowned rapper, he was doing actual populist politics. Right. He was doing retail politics. He was on the ground. He was interviewing people on the street. Hey, what do you think about food vendor licenses? What do you think about grocery store prices? What do you think about rent? Again, all of his solutions are disastrous. But in this moment, especially when people, how do we say this? High time preference people don't care about civilization or the cost of solutions, just that someone is talking about them. They don't understand the origin of the problem. So they just look at food prices and say they're high. And they just say, oh, rent is high. They don't think about why. They don't think about the fact that the mass immigration, the insane leftist attempts to control the city are driving up all these prices. The cause and effect doesn't exist to them. They just want to hear someone say something about it. So Cuomo is kind of parroting the institutional line of like, foreign policy. We need to talk about foreign policy, as if any New Yorker gives a crap about what's going on between Israel and Iran right now. To be fair, obviously the Republican Party is doing the exact same thing right now. Lots of people screaming, why aren't we doing mass deportations? Why are we spending all of our money trying to figure out how to shoot down rockets for Israel? Like that's a real issue on both parties. But one of the big reasons this guy won is he was willing to do populist politics, and people care far more about someone going up and saying, how do you feel about this, than actually having a thought out solution. Let's see. Gabby of Limburg says, OGC, New York City, make NYC Rhodesia again. Again, OGC, great organization, the Old Glory Club. If you are in New York City, I know they're trying to get a chapter started up there. So, maybe you can help save the city, because Burden and I aren't sure about this route forward, but God bless you if you're trying, by all means.
I would love to be wrong. I'll put it that way.
Absolutely. Yeah, please prove us wrong. Mart Gates said, thank you for these daily streams. Well, thank you, man. Remember, of course, that we go live Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Most days of the week, we're doing something. Thursdays, usually an essay, but trying to put out as much content as we can. And I really appreciate you guys supporting us here. Thuggo says the problem we have in Congress is Congress refuses to legislate, so the executive court and courts are stepping in to fill the void. Yeah, that's exactly right. Ultimately, Congress has become a fundraising institution. All the actual governance has been pushed to the executive branch and, more importantly, executive agencies. And a lot of libertarians and even some conservatives were angry about Trump and his War Powers Act, usage and these things recently. But let's just be honest. There's no actual appetite for governing in Congress. Whether you like that truth or not, it's just where we are. Enrico Palazzo says, tell Keith Woods to can the Midwestern accent. Nobody is buying it.
Enrico, you wound me to my core because I am not only not Midwestern, I've never been to the Midwest. So unfortunately, I just went to college, and so I don't have an accent. But
Yeah, I suffer from. I've lived nowhere but the South my entire life. But because my dad was in the Air Force, we moved over a couple of years. I've got on certain phrases, I've got a little bit of a draw, but not. I don't sound like I'm from Tennessee or Georgia or anything. Yeah. That non-regional diction got both of us. Tiny Stupid Deedon says, once again, I'm reminding everyone that in the marketplace of ideas, that is democracy, punish my enemy and give them their stuff away always triumphs. Yes, absolutely. Patronage is the core of politics. Altheist says, conservatives need to learn that when 30,000 Goths cross the Rhine, spending 4 years debating with them on the merit of the Roman Constitution isn't going to stop them from sacking Rome. Yes, absolutely correct. Again, everybody loves the Roman Empire references, but only because there's 1,000 things to learn in every aspect of it. He also says the letter of Cassiodorus included debates between Gothic kings and Roman senators. The senator would point to their constitution. The Goths pointed to their sword. Yes, Vae Victis is always the correct understanding of political reality. Possum says, might be tactically foolish to label libs as socialists. Who's our audience? Boomers. His socialism almost non-existent. Big problem is his liberalism. I hear what you're saying, but in this case, it actually applies because he's literally a socialist. Like, I'm not like,
he labeled himself as such.
He is part of the DSA. Like obviously that's not a real thing. So they run as Democrats. But he is literally a socialist. When he's posting his plans for New York and bullet points, he puts a little socialist rose in front of each one. I hear you. Let's not run around calling everything communism or socialism, but in this specific case, it is actually factually correct.
So he is just as much a rapper as he is a socialist, self-described on both counts.
That's right. Let's see I wonder if he's giving away all of his music on SoundCloud. Is he holding that? All right, guys, that is the end of our super chats. Thank you, everybody, for coming by. Of course, if you have not been following Mr. Burden or checking out his work, you should definitely do that. If it's your first time on this channel, please make sure to subscribe. Before I get into the rundown, I just want to say quickly, I know that Z-Man was a friend of yours. He was on your show on a regular basis. I was not as familiar, but I'd seen a few of his shows. And then obviously a number of us met him recently at the OGC conference when he was there. I wouldn't say I'm a friend of his by any means, but the few conversations I had with him, he seemed like a great guy. And sadly, we recently received news of his passing. So as a guy who's very, I think, well regarded in our circles, just want to acknowledge that he'll be missed. And I know, you were obviously far closer to him than I, but I think a lot of people are feeling that loss.
Yeah, thank you, Auron.
Again, if it's your first time on the channel, please go ahead and click subscribe, bell notification, all that stuff. And if you would like to get these broadcasts as podcasts, you need to subscribe to the Auron MacIntyre Show on your favorite podcast platform. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And as always, I will talk to you next time.